Donald Trump has never been one to shy away from confrontation, especially when he believes someone has crossed him publicly. Throughout his career in both business and politics, he has built a reputation for hitting back at critics swiftly, often with legal threats, social media posts, or public rebukes. So, when Representative Jasmine Crockett directly challenged him during a congressional hearing, pressing him on issues of accountability, it was no surprise that he would eventually respond. What was surprising, however, was the method he chose. Instead of relying solely on rhetoric or a counterattack through the media, Trump attempted to escalate matters into the legal arena, filing a motion that sought to portray Crockett's comments as not only unfounded, but worthy of serious consequences, even hinting at potential jail time. The filing, quickly leaked to reporters, framed Crockett's sharp questioning as defamatory and obstructive to ongoing legal proceedings connected to Trump's other battles. For many observers, this move carried the familiar hallmarks of Trump's playbook. Use the weight of legal systems not just to win a case, but to intimidate and silence opponents. It was a strategy he had employed for decades in his business life, often burying smaller adversaries under the cost and stress of lawsuits. But this time was different. This was not a local contractor or a business rival. This was a sitting member of Congress with a national platform. The language within the motion itself revealed much about Trump's approach. It painted Crockett's questioning during hearings as reckless and damaging, suggesting that her words undermined both his reputation and his legal standing. To Trump, the courtroom was another battlefield, and if he could transform Crockett's words into a legal liability, he might dissuade her and others from pressing further in the future. Yet the very act of pushing such a claim sent shockwaves through Washington, because it was virtually unheard of for a former president to pursue a sitting lawmaker this way. Even political adversaries accustomed to Trump's bombastic style were caught off guard by how far he was willing to take this particular feud. As news of the filing spread, legal experts weighed in almost immediately, noting that the chances of success were slim. Defamation cases in the United States require a high burden of proof, especially when public figures are involved. Moreover, congressional speech during official hearings is generally protected. Trump, however, has often shown a willingness to pursue legal fights regardless of the odds, understanding that sometimes the process itself, rather than the outcome, can serve as a form of punishment. Filing against Crockett seemed less about winning in court, and more about sending a message. Anyone who challenges him too forcefully should expect retaliation. This tactic was consistent with how Trump has viewed power. For him, the legal system has often doubled as a tool of negotiation, leverage, or even intimidation. Throughout his career, whether in real estate disputes, media spats, or political battles, he leaned heavily on the perception that fighting him could carry serious consequences. By going after Crockett, he was effectively extending this philosophy into the realm of legislative oversight. It was as if he hoped to remind members of Congress that speaking against him might carry risks beyond the political arena. However, this attempt also highlighted the growing tension between Trump's instinctive style of confrontation and the institutional safeguards of American democracy. Crockett was not just a critic on television or social media. She was an elected official operating within the framework of congressional duties. Trying to reframe her sharp words as grounds for legal punishment touched a nerve in Washington and beyond, raising concerns about the precedent it could set. If such an action succeeded, it might embolden future leaders to use courts to silence legislative scrutiny, eroding the separation of powers that anchors the system. Still, from Trump's perspective, the risk was worth taking. He had long believed in pushing boundaries, confident that boldness often works in his favor. Even if courts dismissed the claim, the act of filing could serve his narrative, portraying himself as a victim of unfair treatment and framing critics like Crockett as reckless actors out to damage him personally. His supporters could interpret the move as a show of strength, evidence that he would never allow attacks to go unanswered. For Jasmine Crockett, however, the filing was more than just political theater. It represented a direct attempt to weaponize the judicial system against her, a tactic designed to chill her willingness to speak freely in the future. Yet in choosing this path, Trump revealed both his reliance on legal intimidation and his willingness to take extraordinary steps against those who dared to keep. When Donald Trump's legal move against Jasmine Crockett became public, many expected her to fire back with the same intensity he had shown. After all, Trump's style of politics thrives on escalation. He provokes, others respond in kind, and the cycle continues. But Crockett did not take the bait. Instead, she chose a response that was calm, measured, and grounded in principles that transcended partisan squabbles. By refusing to mirror his aggression, she not only maintained her composure, but also reframed the entire situation as a matter of democratic accountability and free speech. Her decision to hold a press conference rather than trade barbs on social media or through late-night interviews revealed a deliberate strategy. Standing in front of reporters, she appeared steady, unflustered by Trump's attempt to drag her into a prolonged legal fight. She made it clear that her role as a representative was to speak for the people of her district, and no threat, whether political or legal, would silence that duty. By doing so, she shifted the focus from Trump's personal grievance to the larger issue at hand, the right of elected officials to question power without fear of retribution. Trump's entire filing had been designed to paint Crockett as reckless and damaging, but her calm demeanor stripped the accusation of its intended sting. Instead of appearing rattled, she projected confidence and clarity. She reminded the public that oversight hearings are not personal vendettas, but essential components of governance. Members of Congress, regardless of party affiliation, are tasked with holding leaders accountable, and silencing them would undermine one of the most basic safeguards of democracy. In emphasizing this, Crockett elevated the conversation beyond herself and made Trump's attempt look less like a legal maneuver and more like an attack on the institution she represented. Her response also highlighted a contrast in leadership styles. Trump has always embraced confrontation as both spectacle and strategy. For him, politics is often about dominating the narrative, seizing headlines, and showing strength through aggression. Crockett, however, leaned into restraint, choosing words carefully and avoiding personal insults. This contrast was striking to the public. While Trump tried to force the moment into another round of bitter political theater, she redirected attention to the principle of speaking truth without intimidation. By doing so, she not only protected herself, but also reinforced the legitimacy of congressional inquiry. The effectiveness of her response lay in its simplicity. Instead of getting bogged down in the details of Trump's filing or legal jargon, she spoke to the broader values that most Americans could understand: fairness, accountability, and the freedom to question those in power. This made Trump's move appear overblown and heavy-handed, almost petty when placed against her steady words. By refusing to match his tone, she created an imbalance. His aggressive attempt to silence her looked desperate, while her composure suggested strength. In many ways, Crockett turned Trump's strategy on its head. He thrives when opponents meet him on his terms, trading insults and becoming entangled in drawn-out battles that keep the spotlight on him. By sidestepping that dynamic, she denied him the satisfaction of another noisy feud. Instead, she kept the focus on her constituents and the principles of her role. This not only strengthened her credibility, but also exposed the weakness in Trump's approach. Intimidation works best when the target reacts with fear or anger, not when they stand calm and resolute. Her response also resonated because it carried an implicit challenge. If Trump truly believed that congressional speech should be curtailed, then he was suggesting a dangerous precedent, that lawmakers should censor themselves out of fear of personal retaliation. By framing her reply as a defense of every representative's right to speak openly, she ensured that her position would be understood not just as personal defiance, but as a collective stand. In that moment, she was not merely Jasmine Crockett defending herself against Donald Trump. She became a symbol of resistance to the broader idea of silencing dissent. Even those outside of her political base recognized the significance of her reaction. Legal analysts, commentators, and everyday citizens pointed out that she managed to dismantle Trump's attempt without raising her voice or resorting to hostility. The optics of the situation favored her heavily, one side attempting to weaponize the legal system against a member of Congress, and the other calmly explaining why such a move was unacceptable in a democracy. This dynamic gave Crockett an edge that no courtroom motion could erase. By answering Trump's move with composure rather than chaos, she set a tone that made his attempt appear not only ineffective, but counterproductive. When Donald Trump's attempt to bring legal pressure against Jasmine Crockett became public knowledge, the reaction from the public and media was swift and overwhelming. For years, Americans had grown accustomed to Trump's combative style and his tendency to use lawsuits or legal threats as tools of intimidation. Yet this particular move struck a different chord. It wasn't aimed at a business partner, a news outlet, or even a rival politician running against him in an election. It was directed at a sitting member of Congress for comments made during the course of her official duties. To many, it seemed like a blatant attempt to weaponize the legal system against oversight, and the backlash reflected just how far people thought he had gone. Almost immediately, legal experts on television described Trump's filing as baseless and without serious merit. They explained that congressional speech during hearings is generally protected, meaning that his attempt to frame Crockett's sharp questioning as defamation was unlikely to succeed in any courtroom. That legal reality didn't just weaken the strength of his claim, it also made it look like a political stunt. Commentators noted that the real target wasn't necessarily the courts, but the court of public opinion. By trying to cast Crockett's words as reckless and damaging, Trump was hoping to discredit her and make others think twice before speaking out. But instead of isolating her, the maneuver backfired in spectacular fashion. Clips of Crockett's response to the filing circulated widely online. Viewers saw a young lawmaker standing calmly before microphones, refusing to be intimidated by the weight of Trump's name or the power he still wielded in certain political circles. In an era where fiery exchanges dominate headlines, her steady tone was refreshing. Millions shared the video not because it was loud or sensational, but because it represented composure in the face of an outsized attack. That quiet firmness resonated with Americans who felt exhausted by years of political drama and who wanted to see leaders approach conflict with integrity rather than bluster. Trump's supporters, of course, rallied to his defense, but even within those circles, there were murmurs of concern. Some questioned whether targeting Crockett in this way helped his cause at all. By elevating her profile, he had inadvertently given her a larger stage. Before the incident, she was primarily known within her district and among political insiders. After the filing and her response, she became a recognizable figure across the nation. For a man like Trump, who is acutely aware of the power of publicity, this outcome was the opposite of what he likely intended. The media's coverage compounded the problem for him. Headlines did not frame the situation as a legal contest between two equals. Instead, they highlighted Trump's attempt to silence a congresswoman. By presenting the story through this lens, journalists underscored the imbalance of power and portrayed Crockett as the underdog standing up against an outsized opponent. Public sympathy naturally tilted in her favor. The more Trump pushed, the more the coverage amplified her image as a fighter for free speech and accountability. Social media also played a pivotal role. Hashtags supporting Crockett began trending, with users drawing parallels between her situation and broader concerns about democratic institutions being undermined. Memes and posts cast Trump as trying to bully a congresswoman, while Crockett was framed as courageously refusing to bow down. The sheer volume of online support added pressure, making it clear that this was not a battle Trump was winning in the eyes of the broader public. Political analysts pointed out that Trump had made a strategic misstep. His attempt to dominate the narrative ended up ceding it entirely. Crockett now had a national audience, and she was using it effectively. Instead of focusing on Trump's grievances, the conversation shifted toward the dangers of intimidation in politics and the importance of protecting free speech. What might have begun as an effort to weaken one of his critics turned into a discussion about his own willingness to use power in ways that many considered heavy-handed or undemocratic. Even some Republicans who typically defended Trump privately admitted the optics were damaging. Going after a young congresswoman over her words in a hearing made him appear insecure, more interested in silencing opposition than addressing it. For someone who often prides himself on projecting strength, The move made him look defensive, as though he could not tolerate scrutiny. Crockett's ability to remain composed only sharpened that contrast, turning what he likely saw as an act of strength into a moment of weakness. By the end of that week, the backlash had fully taken shape. Courts dismissed the legal attempt as meritless, pundits dissected the failure, and Crockett walked away with a... When the court ultimately dismissed Donald Trump's motion against Jasmine Crockett, it marked more than just a legal setback. It symbolized the collapse of a strategy that had been intended to silence her. The ruling was swift and decisive, with judges noting that the claims lacked legal foundation and, in many ways, overstepped the boundaries of what could reasonably be argued. For Trump, who had used lawsuits and legal maneuvers as weapons for decades, the dismissal was a rare moment where the tactic not only failed, but backfired in full view of the public. Instead of weakening his opponent, it gave her new strength and credibility. Crockett emerged from the courtroom not as a lawmaker under legal siege, but as someone vindicated by the very system that Trump had tried to use against her. She did not need to gloat or deliver harsh words about the ruling. The outcome itself spoke loudly. By attempting to frame her congressional questioning as grounds for legal punishment, Trump had handed her the opportunity to stand taller, and when the court rejected his argument, it only amplified her legitimacy. In the eyes of many Americans, she had weathered an attack from one of the most formidable figures in modern politics and come out stronger than before. The dismissal also carried broader implications. It signaled that Trump's attempt to use the legal system as a tool of political retribution had limits, and those limits had been reached. Courts are not immune to political pressure, but they are also designed to uphold constitutional protections, and in this case, the protections around congressional speech held firm. For Crockett, this outcome wasn't just personal. It was a victory for the institution she represented. She had stood her ground, and the judiciary confirmed that oversight and free speech could not be so easily undermined. Trump, of course, tried to spin the loss as yet another example of bias against him. He suggested that the courts were stacked, that the system was rigged, and that he had been treated unfairly. But those explanations did little to undo the optics of what had occurred. His critics seized on the ruling as proof that his tactics were becoming less effective, while his allies were left to defend a move that had yielded no tangible results. Instead of silencing Crockett, he had given her the spotlight, and now she stood as an even more formidable voice against him. In the weeks that followed, Crockett's profile grew significantly. She was invited onto national television programs, where she spoke not only about the incident, but also about the issues that had motivated her questioning in the first place. Every appearance reminded viewers that she was the lawmaker who had stood up to Trump's attempt to intimidate her and come out victorious. For Trump, whose political strategy often relies on overshadowing opponents, this was a particularly bitter outcome. He had tried to push her into the shadows, but instead she had stepped into the light and people were paying attention. The irony of the situation was difficult to ignore. Trump had built much of his public persona on the idea of being a deal-maker and fighter who always came out on top. Yet here he was, bested not by a corporate titan or a political heavyweight, but by a congresswoman who simply refused to be intimidated. The more he insisted on portraying himself as the victim of unfair treatment, the more the public saw Crockett as the one who had been targeted and vindicated. His attempt to display dominance ended up exposing vulnerability, and in politics, appearances matter as much as outcomes. Crockett's strengthened position after the dismissal also sent a message to others in Washington. If Trump's strategy was to intimidate lawmakers into silence, the result showed that such tactics could be resisted successfully. Her composure and resilience became an example of how to withstand the pressure he often exerted on his critics. Rather than discouraging others, the failed attempt may have emboldened them, showing that challenging him need not end in political ruin. The outcome also highlighted an important truth about power. It is not only about who can shout the loudest or wield the most resources, but about who can withstand pressure and remain steady. In this case, Trump's wealth, influence, and legal team were not enough to achieve his goal. Crockett's calm response, The public's support and the court's rejection created a narrative in which she looked strong and principled, while he appeared desperate and overreaching. By the time the dust settled, Trump was left with little to show for his effort beyond headlines that cast him in an unfavorable light. Crockett, on the other hand, walked away with more influence than she had before, her voice amplified by the very attempt to silence it. In trying to make an example out of her, Trump had inadvertently created a moment that underscored the limits of intimidation and In the end, the clash between Donald Trump and Jasmine Crockett revealed something larger than a single legal filing or a brief political skirmish. It exposed the limits of intimidation in a system that, at its best, is designed to safeguard accountability. Trump had entered the situation with the confidence of someone who had used legal maneuvers for decades to pressure opponents, to exhaust them, and to send a message to anyone who dared to challenge him. But this time, the strategy faltered. Instead of silencing Crockett, it turned her into a symbol of resilience, a reminder that power can be confronted not only with force, but with composure and conviction. The contrast between the two figures was striking. Trump, with his long history of high-profile battles, projected the image of a man who sought to dominate through sheer force of will. Crockett, by contrast, embodied steadiness. She didn't need to match his rhetoric or escalate the fight. Her calm response, rooted in principle, resonated because it stood in such sharp opposition to the chaos Trump attempted to unleash. It reminded people that sometimes the strongest statement is not the loudest one, but the one that refuses to waver. The public's reaction also carried weight. Americans, weary of constant political turbulence, responded to Crockett's poise. They saw in her a leader who was unwilling to bend under pressure, but also unwilling to descend into the bitterness that has too often defined modern politics. Trump's move, meant to demonstrate dominance, instead appeared desperate, and the dismissal of his legal filing only cemented that perception. In a way, the court's ruling became a symbolic moment, proof that democratic institutions, though imperfect, still have the power to reject overreach and protect those who speak truth to power. For Crockett, the episode marked a turning point. She walked away not only with her credibility intact, but with her voice amplified on a national scale. She had been thrust into the spotlight by Trump's attempt to silence her, and she used that moment to reaffirm her commitment to representing her constituents and holding leaders accountable. Rather than shrinking under pressure, she expanded her influence. That outcome underscored a truth that Trump, despite his political instincts, seemed to miscalculate. Attempts to suppress criticism often give it more oxygen. And for Trump, the episode was a reminder that not every battle can be won with the old tools. Legal threats and intimidation may have served him in business disputes or personal rivalries, but when turned against an elected official, protected by the very framework of the Constitution, those tools proved inadequate. The dismissal was more than a legal defeat. It was a symbolic setback, one that made him look less untouchable and more vulnerable than he likely intended. Ultimately, this moment will be remembered not just as another chapter in Trump's long list of confrontations, but as a story of resilience. It showed how an attempt to weaken an opponent can strengthen them instead, how a heavy-handed strategy can collapse under its own weight, and how a calm, steady response can resonate more powerfully than bluster. In trying to silence Jasmine Crockett, Trump inadvertently amplified her, and in doing so, he reminded the nation that intimidation may be loud,